good evening to everyone. I feel a need to say that it's the morning, early morning on Saturday for me here. It's quite strange to get this sense of everyone going to bed when I get up. And when I get up, it's really crazy. It's spring on the way here. We have rain, but between the rain showers, it's really sunny and warm. It's the New Zealand way. They say 4 seasons in one day is the kind of experience we have. So a lot of interesting changes for me, but I'll start off with a kind of an account of how this book came about. I thought that might be useful. So I was the deputy course leader on the new school course, the DPsych, and I kind of got volunteer delegated the task of looking at research and supporting publication from student research. We had the idea that we could have a student research conference each term, and I think this book came out of the first term. The first term had a theme of trauma, and this conference went on each term for a few years there with different themes each time. But trauma seemed to be, something that a lot of students were looking at in different ways. So we brought that together and then invited other people to join in a book. So it's been a collaborative exercise. I felt it took a while to get the book from proposal through to publication, but actually I'm told it's quite quick. It's only been a couple of years, which often books take longer than that. So clearly we have been organised, and thank you everyone for contributing. We thought this evening with you, if we start with Emmy, who's written our foreword, and then we go round the authors who are present, and each can present on their chapter. I can then round up at the end for the authors who aren't here, just giving a quick summary of their chapters. I have presented on this a couple of times here in New Zealand, and it's been received well. I'm kind of getting the feedback that the book is useful. It's filling a gap, that existential approaches to trauma is a developing area that we need to think about and work on. So hopefully further research and publications may come. But I'll hand over to Emmy.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Well, I think I should start by saying congratulations on the launch of this book, which, as you're pointing out, is filling a gap and was long overdue, I think. So thank you for doing the work. And let's wish the book good luck, and may many people learn from it. I think it has a wonderful wealth of information in it, and I was very pleased to be able to write a short foreword for it, in which I obviously pointed out how the whole book has come out of the work at the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling in London. And we have the principal here today, Claire Arnold Baker, and she will be speaking about her chapter in the book. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Simon, but I think all of the authors of the book are either students or staff or graduates of the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling, and it kind of brings together a lot of the different layers of research on trauma from an existential perspective that have sort of come out of the New School over the past few years. So it is a very important moment to draw that together and to have this text to refer to. Why is that important? Well, because the existential approach to trauma gives a very different take on it than the kind of current established ways of looking at trauma. The existential approach is always deeply rooted in a philosophical understanding, and in this particular subject, it is particularly appropriate because from an existential perspective, we're very used to the idea that life is difficult and that trauma is very much part and parcel of human existence, and that adversity can come and shatter your life and force you to find a deeper source for your survival, so that it can bring you to thought. It can bring you to a more profound way to make sense of the situation you suddenly find yourself in. And when you do that, when you step up, as it were, in that situation, what often happens is that your perspective shifts and that you get a stronger sense of meaning. Now, it's all very well to make such statements, but this book illustrates that and provides the evidence for that. And that evidence has often been missing from an existential perspective. So we have plenty of existential philosophers like Karl Jaspers who speak about limit situations and point out that everybody will be faced with those limit situations, will experience pain and illness and loss and doubt and destruction and fear and death, but that many people live in denial of that fact and try to avoid that in the most possible ways they can imagine. And of course, everyone will also have a chance to experience the opposites of pleasure and health and joy and confidence and creativity and love and everything that is good. But what the existential approach does is to show that these tensions between these opposites are actually something that it is important for us to learn to work with. Viktor Frankl spoke about taking responsibility for your own attitude towards your suffering when it can no longer be avoided. And he spoke even about changing tragedies into triumphs. So this idea that from an existential perspective, there is much to learn from trauma has been around for decades and even centuries, but it is only now that we are getting to formulate it more specifically. And I think this book really will give us sort of a stepway approach towards doing that. Now, in my foreword, I also speak a little bit about how the idea of trauma is always central to existential literature, not just to existential philosophy. So, for instance, Flaubert in Madame Bovary talks about existential crisis and describes the suffering in great detail. And Dostoevsky, for instance, in his novel Crime and Punishment, illustrates the very difficult path of dealing with adversity, even when you've brought it upon yourself, as is in the case in Crime and Punishment. And of course, going further back, Shakespeare does the same. All these kinds of well-known, highly successful novels and plays are poignant examples of people going through traumatic experiences and having to bring out of those their existential learning, discovering all kinds of rules and laws about living. Often, of course, in the form of a tragedy, not just a trauma, and the sense that people might be slipping into an abyss or that they are going down the wrong path while faced with the shadows of human existence. So to learn about how we can navigate existential trauma in a way that might be productive and might be leading to a new flourishing, to a new beginning, is a very important thing to do. I think most people are aware of Nietzsche's statement that what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, something he said in his book, The Twilight of the Idols. But I like to remind people that this isn't strictly true, that some things actually do kill you, and that some trauma is lethal, but that once you have been able to survive your trauma, then you stand a good chance of learning and changing from it, and indeed to do this thing that we see in these novels and plays, which is to become a hero or a heroine in your story and find a way to transcend this problem and kind of rise up to a different level of experience altogether. So this kind of emotional and mental journey of transformation is possible, and it is different for each person. And it isn't always successful, but as existential therapists, it's our job to understand how we can enable people to grab a hold of that and to find this new mentality of mastery over their fate, and to learn to tolerate anxiety and uncertainty, and to find out new things on this journey of adversity, which brings understanding of new things like truth or kinship and loyalty and generosity and overcoming yourself and honesty and owning up and understanding life, and also sometimes discovering a sense of humor and different ways of being with these difficulties. In other words, it's all about finding new ways of standing in your troubles and becoming more resilient. Now we're going to hear from many authors who are actually many researchers who have looked very specifically at how people have done that in very particular situations, and how they have moved from what might have been seen as victimhood and affliction to something much more promising and much more with much more future to it. And I shall be looking forward very much to hearing from them, because they have looked at how they can take people in that situation to become authorities on their own fate and to actually share the wisdom that they have brought out of the difficulties and the purgatory that they have been through. So thanks for letting me speak, and over back to you, Simon.
Thank you, Annie. That's very inspiring and a wonderful overview. Um, yes, for me, what was most interesting was that there is such a variety of different traumas and responses to them
Hmm.
and ways of understanding. So yes, people are creative, but you're right, limit situations, everyone is stuck in some difficult encounter with austerity and they reveal aspects of our vulnerability, our mortality, our transience, and we have to make sense of that. But moving on, we've got a few authors to listen to. So shall we follow the um, the book chapter in its order, and Claire, you would be next.
Thanks, Simon. Um, and thank you for letting me be a author in your book. And it's, as Emmy said, it's wonderful to see so much of contribution that the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling has made to this book through all of the research. And yeah, and seeing all of our graduates and students and staff members here today contributing to the book. So and congratulations. Absolutely, you did the book in record time. I have to say, some of the books that Emmy and I have worked on together have taken a little longer. So, yeah, well done for putting all of this together so quickly. So, my chapter was about birth trauma and existential crisis, and this is very much around an area that I've also written about, research, and a lot of the work that I do now are with mothers who have suffered a birth trauma. Um, and I think one of the things about birth trauma is that it's not universally seen as most people think about giving birth as something that's joyful and welcomed and a loving experience. And there are a significant number of women who have, really difficult and often traumatic births. And I guess there's something about the experience of birth which is which brings both birth and death together in that moment, that kind of sort of leads to, an experience of birth trauma. So the research that I did wasn't looking specifically at birth trauma, but I think that a lot of what I've subsequently built on from my research is around how the experience of becoming a mother, in particular, for the first time, it creates an existential crisis. And so a lot of the analysis that I did demonstrated how pretty much on every single dimension of their existence, from the personal and the physical, spiritual, social dimensions, the mother experiences a change. So there's something around, her physical body changes. She has this experience of being connected to a sort of a life and death situation. And then, in terms of social roles, that those change. She takes on a new role in society. Her relationships change, both with her, her family and her friends, and personally, her identity changes, and then spiritually, her sense of motivation change, her sense of purpose change. And so there's something about that kind of existential crisis on top of what could be a traumatic birth that really does lead to this kind of idea of an existential shattering, and that Hoffman talks about in his work. Um, and and I think there's the thing that's really interesting, I think, around birth trauma, is that we can't always tell from the type of birth that somebody has whether it's going to be traumatic or not. And I think this is something around trauma that is about, well, how each individual makes sense of their experience. So you might have two women who have similar types of birth, and one of those women will experience it as traumatic and the other one won't. So I think it's that really highlights for me that kind of important element of trauma, is that we can't tell from the outside as an outside person how a person experiences trauma. It's very individualized. Um, and so yeah, so I think that's, it's kind of really important. And also another element is that and again, I can't remember, this was actually a figure that was used at a conference that I went to on birth trauma several years ago. But apparently, there are more traumatized women with suffering from PTSD than there are veterans coming back from war. So I think, that's important to also think about the impact that birth trauma can have on women. So I'll probably just leave it there, because I also want you to read the chapter and the book, so I don't want to tell you everything about what I've said. So I don't know, maybe if people have got more questions, then yeah, I'd love to kind of answer those later.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, this is a little bit of a difficult thing to manage, to get everyone to speak and then to have a bit of time at the end, hopefully for some questions. So thank you for being brief. We'll move on. Do we have Natalie here at all? Natalie Fraser. If she isn't here, I will just mention quickly her chapter on enduring rape and some very useful exploration that she has around myths. So traumas always take place in social contexts, and identity transformation is a difficult part of that. What does it mean for someone to have become perceived as a victim or a survivor or an accuser? And they're not roles that they wanted to take on, and it's challenging to think about the consequences of the trauma, not just the physical impact on the body, but how do we now make sense of our life? I won't say any more, saving time. Moving on, I wonder, Amy Bramley looks at grooming in adolescence, and April Mangan looks at childhood abuse, particularly around this idea of event centrality, the idea that someone makes sense of their existence by reference to this event, this trauma that has happened for them, and it becomes attached to their identity again. Scrolling down through my list, Chloe Paidossis Mitchell. Is Chloe with us? I expect some people have wanted to come but might not have made it. If not, Chloe's looking at, I mean, you have the book, don't you, already? So, she's looking at traumatic grief, and it's a really good chapter to look at. Tanya, surviving cardiac arrest, and then Jackie. So I have seen you. You are here somewhere, hopefully.
I am here, Simon.
Great. Do you want to give us a brief outline of your chapter?
Okay, thank you. So my chapter looks at the impact of anti-Black racism on the individual. And what I wanted to do in this chapter, and in fact my research, because the chapter does come out of my doctoral research, was to challenge the narrative that that Black people who experience anti-Black racism are in some ways, kind of scarred by that permanently, and even their subsequent generations are scarred by that, irrespective of historical context or irrespective of any other kind of factors such as their own experiences or cultural identity. So what I wanted to do was actually to focus very specifically on groups of people or groups of women specifically, who I felt had actually challenged that through their achievement in the workplace. So I looked specifically at the experiences of a group of women, and I will hold my hand up, I'm one of them, who are the children of the Windrush generation. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, but the Windrush generation are a group of people who came from the Caribbean to the UK post-war, so from about 1945 to the early 60s. And I was looking at not only their experiences of their parents, but also the experiences of their daughters who were born in the UK. And obviously they're being shaped by the experiences of their parents. And I don't know if Emmy remembers this, but I remember when I was doing my Pat Viva and I was talking about it, I think originally I was going to look at women of Caribbean heritage. And I think Emmy said something about, well, how different are the islands? And I think, well, actually, there are differences between the islands. And I think this illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. There are not only differences between Black groups, there are also differences between, Black people from all different cultural identities. So I think with Emmy's guidance, so thank you for this, Emmy, I decided to focus specifically on women of Jamaican heritage, which is also my heritage as well. And what I wanted to understand was how the impact of their heritage impacted their experience of anti-Black racism. So in my research, all of my participants particularly in their formative years. All of them had experienced racism. But what was interesting is that those who really did, kind of achieve and actually, in terms of build a kind of healthy psychological functioning, it was really their kind of connection to their cultural identity and a way of not only looking at their blackness as in some way, of less value, but being able to reconstruct their blackness and reconstruct their identity as something positive. And I think it does fit with a lot of what Emmy was saying, and also some really broader existential themes around the fact that, trauma happens to everybody, and there should be no reason why anti-Black racism is going to be the one thing that is going to destroy your life. There will be lots of things that people are going to contend with. And in my research, I mean, there were a number of people, obviously, who had other factors that had contributed to their lives, which were also difficult. But what these women really demonstrated, I think, in my research, was that they were able to give some value back to their lives, and also to connect with their agency. And again, that's another important theme within existentialism. And I really wanted to challenge this, which I feel is as a kind of dominant narrative, that somehow the experience of anti-Black racism renders you a victim, and a victim forever, and even your subsequent generations become a victim forever. My research absolutely doesn't point to that. There is always that possibility of people being able to construct meaningful lives out of those experiences. And a bit like what Claire said, I think I will stop now so that you can read my chapter. But do please feel free to ask any questions. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm sure we'll have questions, and perhaps we'll save that for the end. I just want to observe that I found it inspiring. My growing difficulty with the idea of trauma was that it's commonly associated with some kind of psychological damage, or there's something wrong with a person, and I don't think there is. I think that anyone would struggle with difficult situations, but as Emma said in her introduction, you find the heroine, the hero within the experience and overcome. So Armin Danish is the next chapter, who carries on this thread. It's political refugees, people who don't perceive themselves as traumatized. They perceive themselves as choosing to stand against an oppressive regime, and therefore they can expect to be oppressed, and they have members of their families killed, and they're suffering because they're in prison and they're tortured, and they become a refugee. But it's suffering that they have, to some degree, brought on themselves by deciding to stand against oppression. And there's a collective sense that they are working together, so they're not alone in this trauma. Or they don't perceive it as trauma, they perceive it as a political campaign for change in their country of origin, which ties in neatly with, compares with Susan Ickovic, who has looked at British military in the Falklands, where, again, people are subject to traumatic experiences which are unpredictable, random, when you're under fire in a war zone. And then they've come back and they're with their families, and there isn't a shared understanding of what's taken place for them. No one's talking about it. And there's a kind of isolation then, which makes things a lot more difficult to manage. So if you have agency in relation to your austerity, if you have a collective connection with others in relation to the difficulties, you are more able to deal with it and find meaning and purpose through it, which I thought was a really valuable and useful finding from the book. And we'll move on to Nicholas, who identifies some of this as well. Thank you, Nicholas.
Absolutely.
Really useful. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, Emmy stole some of my sandwiches. That's an expression we have in the military when someone says everything that you want to say. I'll see what I can add to it. Thank you very much to previous speakers as well. So my research was on humanitarians. I used to be a humanitarian in war zones. So I was hoping to research PTSD on humanitarians when they return from these scary places like Afghanistan and Iraq, etc., and totally failed. They weren't traumatized. They didn't talk in terms of PTSD. They talked about some things was scary, and the most tricky thing was actually coming home. So I did a deeper dive into it, desperately trying to save my doctoral research, and I found out that suffering is quite human, as we all know. And that's in every culture, all through history. But the delineation of like suffering to trauma, PTSD, that's something very new. Kind of comes somewhere from Freud and then marketed by Van der Kolk, etc., to create this rigorous thing. And so what my chapter actually become, and what much of my doctoral research, this chapter in this book is what happens when you inscribe yourself with trauma, when you label yourself as traumatized, or someone else labels you as traumatized, right? What happens with that suffering that then becomes a thing and reified as this thing and has all these medical supposed research around it. And I guess to summarize what the chapter comes up with is that it creates three things. It creates a vulnerability, right? I'm going through life, things are happening to me. I am currently in the army, and you see things and you go, oh my God, I might get traumatized. And this is something that the humanitarians talked about as well. Oops, I'm scared of getting this, of catching this, right? So instead of being resilient, or even the next level, which is anti-fragile, that thing of growing through adversity, you are more vulnerable. That's one possibility. The other possibility is stuckness. You get stuck in this story, so whether you get it, this trauma or not, but if you now think that you have it and you're working with someone and you feel that it just gets worse, you can't get out of it because this is your life. This is who you are. And finally, a different group, those of us, all of us that suffer and that we want to have an identity, we want to have a reason for why we do all these crazy things and why we have all these preferences and why we always get into trouble and always have these perhaps unfulfilling relationships. And that is the subcategory of clients who are looking for the answer in terms of what was it that happened. Van der Kolk talks a lot about that, some trauma that can be recovered, that you can kind of remember, and then you realize it was all because of that. And that's it's not you, it's that over there. So you relinquish your freedom, you blame that as opposed to taking care of yourself. So what my trauma ends on then is, what my chapter ends on is, how do you work with that? How do I take in your story, which is perhaps that you are traumatized, and totally believe it, totally hear it, yet start to look at the edges, you know, when there is a bit of freedom, when you can have a bit of choice, when you can have a bit of growth, and this ceases to be this determining reason for everything in your life. And yeah, that's what I wrote about. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. Yes, you're reminding me of this core principle in existential philosophy that Freud and his gang were looking at the past, trying to find the root cause of what happened with this cause and effect flow through life. Whereas existentialists will look at the future and potential for non-being and be a little bit more concerned about how we're going to manage our lives going forwards. So yes, the client who comes and wants to know why they are the way they are, looking for that trauma that they may have repressed, needs a little support in thinking forward in life. Yeah, it's really useful. Thank you. I need to mention Polina Luknova, and her work overlaps with my own in the idea of vicarious trauma. So Polina was looking in particular at therapists who have their own history of trauma, and she used the terms primary and secondary trauma. So the primary trauma is their own experience. Secondary is the impact that the client's traumatic experiences might have on them, and the difficulty that some of our participants had in maintaining that separation, which I found really interesting. I mean, clearly, there's a stronger or deeper empathetic connection when you've had your own difficulties and you can understand the difficulty of others more intensely, but it still requires that separation. And it's really interesting in my own study that I found my participants who had struggled with potential or actual death of clients, most of them could recall their own difficulties, traumas, bullying, exclusions, discriminations, which motivated them to come into the caring professions because it seems they wanted to be around others who had struggled in similar ways and to help them. They were giving back. They were grateful that they had come through difficulties and found a career in a profession and success and wanted to give back. So there's a lot of complex relationships between our own experiences of trauma and the experiences of our clients that I've tried to look at, and I think perhaps we need to look at it in more detail. But I'll move on and Mark, yeah. Mark Bowes.
Thanks. 1 second. Let me just do this. Really glad to be here, really excited to be talking about the book and had the opportunity to contribute to it. Having had the opportunity now to read it all for a second time, I feel really heartened with all the research that's emerged. And as Emmy said, within all those different ways in which, however we describe it, traumatic experiencing might emerge. I guess my chapter in some way feels quite techie, I would say. So I used it as an opportunity to reflect on the whole book, think about where we are in terms of the existentialism of trauma, and then very much right from my own perspective, which looks at interpersonal traumas. To give you a taste of that, I have this philosophical I guess, issue with this repetition within Danzig's analysis and also within humanistic forms of existentialism that really want to push apart the ontic, very difficult and painful parts of trauma. I would say probably the lived visceral trauma with something philosophical and ontological and beyond us. And for me, there is no separation. I really don't resonate with this want to separate between people who experience an ontic trauma that's very traumatic for them and then this ontological trauma that only some people experience. And I critique that within my chapter and also look at a socio-cultural lens to think about contextual factors by which some people are afforded the space or particular place in their bodies and minds to be able to conceive of it as a confrontation with their existence. But for me, it is always a confrontation with our existence. And that is my definition, I guess, of trauma, which is trauma is a particular movement in relation to our existence and the way in which we encounter the confrontation or the foundations of our existence. But it's not just that. It's then this resulting, as Langley talks about, sense of incomprehensibility in ourselves, others, and the world around us. And then in the face of that, I'm very movement-based, so the movements, the existential movements we make in relation to that. That might be us facing those illusions we had about ourselves and the worlds in wanting to re-illusion ourselves, which might be incorporate what we've experienced of the foundations of our existence within the worldview, the modes we already live in. Or it might be a disillusionment, which is to turn away from what we've known and try and incorporate what we've discovered about the foundations of existence within a disillusionment. Or it might be trying to synthesize both. So disillusionment, like a rediscovery of something about the foundations of our existence. There's a lot more, but I'm not going to go into it. Just two things I wanted to highlight, which is in the book, and the chapter, I give a really brief introduction to one of the methods that I work with, which is borrowed from social human geography and turned into a method for psychotherapy, which is called ontography, which is a phenomenological method for trying to understand the lived questions we have about our confrontations with existence through trauma and the ways that we embody and live these through our life at both a conscious or reflexive or unconscious or pre-reflexive level. Finally, in the book, which is really important to me, I always take issue because I go to lots of trauma conferences, being a psychotraumatologist, whether you like that title or not. And what fascinates me is the want for all trauma therapists to say, I'm a great person. And what I do is always reflect on trauma, and I do no harm in the world, and no one should do any harm in the world. And for me, that rings really hollow. You know, we all have what Rollo May and Stephen Diamond called our daemonics. Our daemonics, like a sense that actually from our very essence, our foundations of our being are these two interweaving forces of creativity and destruction. And we all have this foundational ability to devastate our lives, other people's lives, the world around us, and also be creative and construct within our lives. And what I do in the chapter is try and talk from a personal, but also through my clinical and research perspective, how people who have experienced interpersonal trauma, in this case sexual violence, actually do encounter their daemonics. They want to devastate and destroy themselves and the worlds around them, and how that is actually part of making sense of that confrontation with existence. And I always plead when I'm talking anywhere that people don't disavow themselves of these destructive or devastating daemonics, because they are like the existential version of the shadow, the Jungian shadow. Like, it's there for all of us. And actually, I have a concern that if we don't own it, if we disavow ourselves of it as trauma therapists or therapists working with people who have had traumatic experiences, we have the possibility to dehumanize and devastate the life of our clients. And therefore, owning this as part of our experience in having encountered trauma is really important. There's just 3 little elements of the book. Some of it gets techie and philosophical, some of it's visceral and descriptive, but hopefully that gives you a flavor or a texture of the chapter. Over to you, Simon.
Yes, thank you, Mark. I've got to thank you as well for bringing it's Ronnie Yanoff Bowman, who has this idea about illusionment. And reading your work, I dug a bit deeper. We can all benefit, can't we, from reading more? Because even though we're being held up here as experts, we are still limited in what we know. And I really value your point about the harm we can do. So if I remember Ronnie's formulation, she's saying that most people suffer from illusions of invulnerability, and trauma reveals realities like the world isn't safe, the world isn't meaningful, and you are not a worthy person. You think you've done well in life and you've followed all the rules, yet you've still got cancer, yet you still had a car accident, yet you were still raped, So that question about whether we're worthy or not, people want to fight back. They want to take control. They want to be powerful. And I can see the demonic in that aspect of it. But we perhaps grow through the realization that we are vulnerable and we live with that. But so these are really, writing and facilitating this process has really helped me to dig deeper into philosophy and research, and it's really been useful. So thank you everyone who's contributed. I want to mention Mary Spring, who wrote a chapter on when our clients commit suicide, which contributes to those 3 last pieces on trauma that's secondary or vicarious, and the possibility of vicarious traumatic growth. Right. Thank you, everyone. We now have space and time for questions. I'm really interested to hear from not just questions, but from anyone who has read chapters and has comments and feedback for us. For me, this is a project that it's not just ending, it's opening to further writing and research. So if anyone has any guidance for us or any thoughts as to where we might go with things next, can I hand over to John, who perhaps could facilitate some questions?
very happy to. I've got my eye in the
Yeah.
chat. If anybody wants to pop in the question in the chat, or you might want to raise your Zoom hand and let us know that you'd like to make a comment, or just wave at the camera. I'll try and keep my eye on everybody too. So, yeah. Susie, I can see you waving. Thank you very much. Let's see if we can get you unmuted and on the screen with us. There we go. Let's see if we can.
Yeah.
I think we're right.
I've
Hi,
not
Susie.
Hi, I've not read the book yet, but I'm very interested in it at the moment. I think, was it Natalie Fraser? Was that trauma through rape? Is that just rape against females, or is it rape against males as well?
Yeah. Hi, Susie. It was just females. Most of this research is phenomenological, so you're just having a small sample group, usually 8 to 10, and most often they are as similar as possible. So you're capturing something about a group who have overlapping experiences. So yes, it's a really useful and interesting chapter, as I say, around the myths. So Natalie observes that we talk about sexual assault, and consent is a big question in rape trials. And this is taking our attention away from what's happening. It's turning it into unwanted sex, when most rape is actually about power and control and domination. And she goes through quite a few myths that circulate around the experience that then color how someone who has come through that experience has to deal with, reporting rape is often far more traumatic than the rape itself. There's often uncertainty about whether it was rape, and did the woman give consent clearly enough, or not consent clearly enough, and those questions are difficult, because if it is rape, the person isn't going to listen to whether they've consented or not. So a lot of complex positionings in post-rape negotiations of what it means and what happens. And that's from memory, my taking away from the chapter. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie, for your question as well. Really appreciate you getting us started on the Q&A part of our event. Thank you. And just keeping my eye on the chat as well. Oh, yes, so we've got a question I could read here. Yeah, I think this one might be for you, Nicholas, I think. So would like to ask the question, there seems to be an inherent trauma in military operations, particularly when service members are required to inflict harm on individuals who may be later classified as, in inverted commas, collateral damage, potentially innocent victims. My question to Nicholas is, does his research acknowledge or engage with the experience of these survivors? Additionally, are there existing studies that focus on the trauma endured by innocent people caught in the crossfire of military actions? I suppose more broadly, I'm asking about how trauma intersects with political structures and judgments. Oh, thank you for this question. Thank you. There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a thorny area, isn't it? So the only thing I can really answer is the soldier officer bit. I don't know. I assume that there's research, but assumptions is the mother of many bad things. So I assume that there's research on victims of collateral damage, innocent victims, all that stuff. In terms of service personnel trauma, it's quite interesting, actually. The level, if you control for social class, background, intellectual ability, all the like, if you try to control for everything, you realize that trauma is fantastically low in the army, which indicates to me that the culprit is probably not what we do in the field, but rather that we are quite vulnerable as it is. So did the infantryman not go out and do whatever he did in Afghanistan? He might just have been traumatized or struggling with his mental health back here. Now that's further backed up by the fact, so I work with military personnel every day, and it is very, very rare that people coming back from mission feel upset about it. Indeed, it is a very intense, and if you look at the evolution of humanity, it's a very intense and peer bonding experience to be in battle. It is often boring, often exciting, often hugely bonding. And the times that it's scary, well, that's probably not the thing that we stay with. So I would caution over or exaggerating the effect of like PTSD. If you go to war, you will get PTSD. Well, our species would not have survived given the stuff that every animal, or at least every carnivore, does to other animals, and the fear that every herbivore experiences. And in the same way, tribal warfare, since the beginning of time, the little records we have, things get ugly, and humans have survived it since the beginning of time. So yeah, that's a long answer to, and probably not an answer to what you were asking. Classic. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you. This is just such a huge topic. Yeah. So I've got mine in the chat, and also, Carol, I can see you've got your Zoom hand up. Let's see if we can open your microphone, Carol.
Yes. On a related matter, something kept cropping into my mind. I haven't quite formulated my question really, but the idea of moral injury kept cropping up in my mind alongside these things. And I'm just wondering if that's covered anywhere in the book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm thanking you all for so many. I mean, my mind just is exploding with all these different ideas, and but that seemed to be something that might sort of thread its way through, but I'm not quite sure.
Thank you. Shall I take that, Carol? It's not in the book as far as I remember, but it is written by Lewis Hoffman. He has an article in the Existential Analysis, and he is saying that it overlaps significantly with trauma. There's also concepts like epistemological injustice. For me, I'm writing a bit more on, and it's like these ideas emerge and are given different names, but the experiences behind them are all human. And like, in social sciences, we constantly need to reinvent language and claim that we found something new. Well, we haven't. We've just experienced the re-emergence of a phenomena that other people have written about and known in new language. And that's an interesting thing for me. So I'm starting to write a bit about existential theory and practice, not as a textbook history of this person came up with this idea in this time and then someone else read it and did that, but it's constantly emerging in human affairs because we're all human and we all exist and we all encounter austerity and trauma. So I don't know if is that a useful answer?
Yes, very, very. It sort of puts a bigger context on things too. Thank you.
Perhaps I could add something to that. It seems to me that some of the chapters do actually speak about that. For instance, Jackie, your chapter brings that very much to the fore, I think. The idea that you can either respond to the situation simply with moral outrage and feel that you have been really treated very wrongly, or you can kind of perceive in your traumatic experience a kind of call to rising to a new moral level, which surpasses what people have been able to do up to then. It is as if those of us who get traumatized are called to try and make sense of what is happening in society and in the world and to us personally, and to come up with an answer that shouldn't have happened. You shouldn't have done that to me. I'm now going to be messed up for the rest of my life and it's your fault. But that comes up with an answer that says something like, how did this happen? Why does this keep happening? What happens between people for this to occur? How can we look at that in a different way? How can we make sense of it? How can we go beyond it? How can we learn from it? How can we find a new way to go forward so that this changes somehow, that there is a sea change somehow? And that to me seems to be the real philosophical and practical challenge that we're facing and that the book points us towards. And I do think, Jackie, that you have definitely brought that into your work. Maybe you'd like to say a word about that?
I think actually I'd even go a little bit further than that, because when you were speaking, Emmy, what came to my mind was, as I was trying to describe in my piece, my focus of the research was on the daughters of, or specifically Jamaican daughters of Windrush parents. But one of the interesting things about my parents' generation when they came to the UK was that they hadn't experienced this kind of devaluation of their blackness because they had come from a society where they were in the majority population. So this may be a bit of a surprise to some people who actually think that all Black people come with somehow some inherent belief that they are inferior. And I think some of that may be because a lot of the research has come out of America, where, the history of segregation and that didn't happen in the Caribbean. So when that Windrush generation came to the UK, they were genuinely shocked by their treatment because they couldn't understand why somebody would see them and see their blackness and think, well, actually, that's of no value. And I think what's interesting when I was thinking about some of the responses of my participants, when they were talking about their parents, what their parents' response was to their experiences, it was, well, actually, why am I'm being treated this way? Because I know my value. So it wasn't a case of somehow I've got to think, well, actually, what these people are doing to me means that I am going to take on board and become that victim. It's actually, well, I know my value and I believe that I have the right to occupy this space. And also their parents would be saying to them, you have the right to occupy that space. And I think for the participants that I focused on, who were ended up being very successful in terms of the work environment, they were able to kind of take in that message, and that helped them to actually challenge some of these negative experiences. I think, does that help in any way kind of add to that? Yeah.
Jackie, it does help me because in the introduction I've mentioned this, existential understandings of trauma have focused on the shattering effect of suddenly realizing that life is not safe and you're not worthy. But other researchers, and I think it probably does come from the USA, talk about insidious trauma, when someone is raised to believe that they are, the wrong color, or that they are too disabled, or they're the wrong gender or the wrong sexuality, and they assume therefore that they're never going to have a right to equal treatment or the opportunities that other people have. So how do you feel about the tension between those things?
Well, I suppose I do understand those tensions, but I think again, what it illustrates to me is that there are just different experiences because, the experience that happened to Black Americans is similar to, clearly, because, they were all descendants of slaves, but it's similar to, but different from the experience in the Caribbean. And as I said, really, to me, to illustrate that point, I think is if you are brought up with this kind of legal segregation as what happened in America based on the color of your skin, you can obviously understand how that's going to make you feel as if you are inferior. And then, of course, that's perpetuated throughout generations. But I think, as I was saying before, that was not the experience, certainly in the Caribbean and certainly not in Jamaica. There was not that experience at all. Clearly, there was colonialism, but most Black people in the Caribbean did not have any much meaningful contact with white people until they came to the UK. And so they would have only really, their only contact would have been with, kind of civil servants or tourists. They would not have had that kind of meaningful contact on a day-to-day basis where they would have perhaps experienced or encountered the kind of racism that we are often, I suppose, most of the literature which comes out of America tells us about the Black experience, really.
Yeah, that's really helpful for me. It's what Emmy said at the start about limit situations and context. We need to be phenomenological. We need to reveal what it is that their experiences in their life, not to jump to conclusions about notions like trauma. Yeah, so that's really helpful. Yes, John, there's a few questions come up. Yeah,
There are a couple of things in the chat. I was also wondering, because I think I'm hearing some things that could be easy assumptions for me to make as a practitioner that who's maybe could be more well informed, I guess, so more well informed by the book. And I was wondering whether there might be other assumptions from other chapters, I guess, that you might think, oh, this would be really helpful for colleagues to know. It might be maybe counterintuitive to what I might hold. I don't know if that question makes sense. If not, there are a couple of things in the chat as well.
That a bit as we go for the
Claire,
questions
I
in the
can
chat,
see.
because it's a good question, John. I'm going through my reading and thinking, what haven't we mentioned? Yeah.
And Claire, I can just see your microphone open.
I just wanted to jump in a little bit because I think there's something certainly that I have kind of noticed in my own work is around the role of expectations. And I think that kind of touched a little bit on what you're saying, Jackie, as well. That, and a bit about Nicholas as well, that how we go into situations, what our orientation is when we go into a situation will also determine whether that is traumatic for us or not. And I think a lot of the work that I do with mothers is really helping them to reevaluate the expectations that they had going into the birth that led it to feel traumatic. Obviously, there were some things that had nothing to do with expectations, but a lot of the work that I end up doing with mothers is around this kind of real mismatch between what their expectations were and then what actually happened to them. And that kind of that difference there made that feel traumatic for them. So again, I just thought that, that kind of felt that it was sort of, there's something about that, and I think certainly what you were saying, Jackie, about, sort of people coming from Jamaica, for example, and then the experience that they had, because they weren't expecting that kind of experience to, when they arrived here. So there's something around, what we make of life and existence, and then how we get confronted by that in terms of experiences, and then how we make sense of that. And that's the bit, isn't it, I think? And that's what I noticed as well in terms of how different experiences, which may seem very similar, can be experienced. So it's their, what they were expecting or how they made sense of it is that kind of individual part of it that was, so I just bring that in.
Thank you, Claire.
Sorry,
John, can I just respond? A couple of chapters there we have childhood sexual abuse and the potential to have post-traumatic growth at the same time as continuing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's not either or. You can recover and have strengths developing at And Amy Bramley's chapter on grooming, at the time that an adolescent is groomed, they don't know that they're being groomed. They think that they're having a relationship, and they're inducted and groomed into thinking they're making choices. Amy, I think, says on average it's 16 years later they come to realize that they were groomed. So this is a trauma that emerged at the event, and it's the meaning of what happened, which is again problematic. So lots of the chapters have really crucial to bear in mind when you're working with someone as a practitioner as to how you would. But I know there's a hand still up, Carol and people. So John, back to you.
Well, yes. Thank you for that, Simon. I think hear about how we expect them to be, but I think it's so helpful to be having some of these other bits of knowledge so that we're kind of more open. Really appreciate it. We've got a question in the chat here we can come to. What about the dysregulation that research showed is caused by complex trauma? View about the fact and how to go forward in life. Sorry, about that fact and how to go forward in life. Overcoming the trauma, as Nicholas said earlier. Don't some traumas have to be owned before they can be?
Should I have a stab at that? The whole Buddhist parable here, but there's a story about, the first arrow hits you and that hurts, and you are furious at who shot it or something. Resentment. I think that the story, something bad happens to me, something overwhelmingly bad. This fan system is some magical polyvagal research, by the way. Talk to any neurologist. It doesn't work that way. So then I have to then go into it, own it. And I do believe that understanding how I got here is really useful for me. But the idea that almost like a curse, exorcism of owning and sitting with and regulating my body, whatever it is, in order to, I think that sounds quite medieval to me when I read Van der Kolk and Gabor Mate, and I would, so my a shorter answer to that is to own it. You be in the future and learn why perhaps you're making specific choices because you learned something by that bastard in the past. But you don't have to go through that whole recovered stuff. It's a myth.
Thank you, Nicholas. Can I also bring in something else on this? So I've read an article by John Upton on the phenomenological experience of being in an earthquake. So it's quite a visceral description of being on a mountain with his wife in a stone-built building and everything starting to shake and the dust coming up. So they were choking and not able to see, trying to get out of the building before it collapsed on them. And then the consequence of that was afterwards that John didn't feel safe inside buildings. He'd lost his faith in the stability of bricks and mortar, and he always needed to know his route out into the open space. His body was just not comfortable in an enclosed building, and he used a movement-based Buddhist meditation practice to take hold of his body and to ground himself again and to trust the ground under his feet. It had to be worked on, to that faith in the ontological reality of the world and its stability had to be recovered. Is that helpful?
Can I add to that, Simon, just very quickly? Notice there, he had to work on his faith to be back in reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is not some kind of body keeps the score. It's a much more subtle and existential way.
Yeah.
Not as linear.
Yeah. Emmy, thank you for your dimensions of existence. We are,
Yes.
because we are all those things at once, embodied, personal, social.
Exactly. So there's lots of stuff happening at lots of different dimensions. But it is true, though, we know it is true that life does work in this kind of balancing way, and that you can get out of sync with your capacity for resting or taking nurturance if you are in a situation of extreme stress or having been injured. So it is true to some extent that you can be out of well, actually, that you are out of sync after something disastrous happens to you. And the first thing, and Nicholas will this know better than any of us, the first thing you do when you intervene in working with people who've been through a natural catastrophe is not to talk with them or talk about emotions. It's about safeguarding and getting them back to being able to have comfort and to be safe in order to be able to rest, get over their wounding, healing, and taking nurturance again. So I think existentially speaking, we know full well that to deal with trauma, you have to be back in a position where you can do the rebalancing of your system, both physically first, but also then with other people, because often in traumatic situations, you lose your faith in humanity, you lose your faith in how people treat each other. So you may need to have to get back to being with people who treat you well in order to get back to being able to measure this for yourself, engage it, instead of having these negative expectations or being so disillusioned. So there is that mechanism is in place. But I know what Nicholas is saying about putting everything on that and acting as if somebody, once something terrible has happened to them, they are kind of shot for the rest of their lives, and they're going to be walking around as wounded people. It simply doesn't work like that, except very rarely. I think what Simon said about both things being true, you learn to get on with it and to rebalance yourself, and at the same time you also maybe remain more vulnerable in some ways. I mean, I had an accident at the age of 10, and I got very worried about traffic coming from the right because that's how I got hit. And I sometimes still think I have a little bit of a response to it, but it's par for the course, and it's been absorbed by a capacity to make myself safe and to trust life again. And that happens for most people, and that is what we need to remember. And more than that, not just do we learn to do the rebalancing and retrieve that capacity, but we also learn something new, which is we can overcome trauma and we can transcend it. And that is the bit that the book really brings out, isn't it?
Yes. I need to correct myself. It's Jason Upton, not John Upton, the book, the article.
I think what we're describing here, it makes the book completely compelling. You've got to get the book, read it, and because I think especially what you're saying here, Nicholas, I can see colleagues in the chat going, "What? What are you saying here?" So, and this is what's so important about research, to be doing that work and go, what is really going on here? Because there's what I want to think is going on when I'm doing therapy, but what's really happening? That's right.
Very true, John. And bear in mind, we've been very slow about this. We've been doing this research for decades, investigating whether these things are actually bearing out in reality and how real people in the real world actually live through these kinds of things and how they process it. And that's taken a very long time. And this is a very significant publication to start bringing this out. Although I did talk about it all in my book that was hidden. Yeah.
We don't
I
want to
still,
forget about
I
that.
still claim that Emmy thing in Everyday Mysteries, best book ever written. After this,
Yes.
That's kind.
And we're
Yes.
just coming into our last minutes, Simon. I wonder what you're thinking in terms of as we come into that.
Well, I'll turn up and be honest with everyone. So I have a lot of anxieties about the whole process of writing this book, but I'm really pleased that it's come out, and I'm really pleased with the book. I think that it is a good book, and it, as Emmy has just said, it is a lot of time of research and intense scrutiny and thinking, and we have a product. I'm anxious about it not selling and it being forgotten, but I'm trying to write further on how we would bring these ideas into practice. That might get published, it might not, but I'm motivated to pursue these ideas. I'm invested in them. So I just want to thank everyone for contributing to this and for turning up and taking an interest, because I think this is an important book, and I really hope that it sells well.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. And with a few minutes to go, any of the other authors might have any parting comments for us? Any kind of thoughts? We've been in some big topics these last
We have got
10
Carol,
people.
who's been trying to ask a question, John, for some time. So, well,
Jackie, I can see your microphone is open as well, but
Wanted this all together, really. So thank you very much for it.
okay.
Yeah. Just a couple of very quick things. I had a couple of reflections, but it's too late now. But the whole context of peer support and people referred to now as experts by experience, who often use their own experience of trauma in counter epistemic injustices that are encountered in the system and the whole complexity of that. But I'm also thinking on that note, John, how at the AD4E festival that's coming up. I'll leave that in your hands, but it's an idea because I
good
think that would be
question,
very, very
Carol.
good. That would be the most receptive audience in a way. I don't know if it's too late to put anything on the agenda, but
Well, and maybe some of the colleagues who have authored might come and do some workshops with us at online events as a way of keeping the book in mind. Some of that, Jackie, we were having a little bit before we go on live. It would be wonderful. One of the authors said that.
Emmy, are you
Yeah.
taking part in the AD4E festival this year?
No, not this year, no, but I will be taking part in the Compassionate Mental Health Conference at Kingsley Hall up there at Kingsley Hall, where anti-psychiatry happened. Therapeutic community there for a day, and I will be there in person talking about well, these kinds of things. How do we find resilience when we spend a lifetime thinking we're mentally ill, and how do we rebuild that kind of trauma? It's a very similar sort of thing.
Yeah. If you know anybody who is at the AD4E festival, you might get them to mention the book.
Yes, well, I'll definitely be there. And Carol,
Okay.
it sounds
Yeah,
like you will be
exactly.
there. So
Yes.
yes, that
I
would be a
shall at every
wonderful thing to
opportunity.
do.
Right.
Yes, wonderful. Yeah. Well, here we are at the end of our time together. It's really been an honor for us at Online Events to host one of the launches for the book. So Thank you, Simon, for that. And thank you to the authors that are here as well for making time to come and give us some sense of what we can expect from the book. I think it's been a really a wonderful way to whet our appetite and to know that there's definitely some ideas that will be new for us as we think about, as we read the book and think about our practice.